Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Dawn in Damnation by Clark Casey. Now, this is actually the first book of a series of paranormal western novels written by Clark Casey, and I believe this series is called Undead in the West. Now, Clark Casey, the author of this book, actually asked if I would review the novel, which I'll admit I was a little hesitant at first to do that, only because I've always been afraid, like, if I review a novel from an up-and-coming author at the request of the author, I've always been afraid of it, like, opening up some kind of floodgate where I'll have all these different up-and-coming authors asking me to review their novels, and I've always been afraid, like, okay, what if I, like, really don't like the book, and I sort of tear it apart? Then I'll feel really bad that they asked me to review it, and I'm, like, really laying hard on it, which, luckily, I actually really liked this book, so you're not going to be seeing me do that, but that's one of my biggest fears about that, and also, I like reading what I want to read when I want to read it. Like, I don't really like taking requests from people, so once again, I was a little hesitant to take his request, but I decided, what the hell, and yeah, so now I'm reviewing his book. And as I said before, I actually really did like this book, and I'm not just saying that because the author asked me to do this review. Like, I actually did genuinely enjoy this. Now, Dawn in Damnation is a horror fantasy western novel with a really interesting premise. Now, I really had no idea what this novel was actually about before I read it, and I'm almost hesitant to explain the plotline of this novel because I really don't want to give too much away. Now, Dawn in Damnation is set in this small town called Damnation, but this is not a town on Earth. This is actually a town that's located in Purgatory, or at least it's some kind of space between heaven and hell. And this town is actually occupied by ghosts, or I'm not really sure if I want to call them ghosts, because they do seem to have some kind of physical bodies, but essentially all the residents of this town are people who died on Earth and somehow ended up here. And it's widely believed among the residents of this town that this is essentially a place for people who weren't evil enough to go to hell but weren't good enough to get into heaven. And many of the residents of this town believe that God is essentially testing them to see who's good enough to get into heaven. And one of the residents of this town is actually a vampire. He's a vampire who died and then came back from the dead as a resident of Damnation. There are also werewolves in this town as well. And essentially, there's no real law and order in this town, and even though everybody's dead, you can still die again, and it's believed that if you die again, you'll go straight to hell. But what happens is, one day this guy named Buddy Baker comes in, and he's an outlaw who was executed on Earth, and he came back to life in Damnation, and he essentially really shakes things up when he ends up becoming the fastest gunslinger in town. Also, a young woman named Miss Parker becomes a resident of Damnation after she drowned herself on Earth, and it turns out, and this might be given away a little too much, I'm not sure, but it turns out that she's actually pregnant. Like, she was pregnant when she drowned herself, and now she's pregnant in Damnation, and this baby that she's about to have is actually alive. Like, it's not a ghost, and it's not a zombie or whatever these people are. Like, it's actually a living human baby. But the coming of this child presents a major problem because the werewolves haven't tasted living human flesh in years, and now they're finally gonna get a chance to, and that's really the main conflict of the story. But yeah, Dawn in Damnation is a very entertaining book, and I definitely recommend this. And it's a really quick read, too. Now, I read this in a couple of days, but that's only because because I read a digital copy of this, and I typically prefer reading physical copies, and I'm sure if I had a physical copy, I probably would have burned through this in maybe a day or two. It only took me longer because I can't really stare at a computer screen reading for too long because it will hurt my eyes. But the book's available on Amazon, so whether you get a digital copy or a physical copy, I definitely recommend giving this a read. And the characters in the book are very likable. Well, I don't want to say all the characters are likable, because there are a lot of characters in this book who are bad people, like really, really bad freaking people. At the same time, though, even the characters who are bad or assholes are still pretty interesting, though, and are still really fun to read about. And I want to say that my favorite character in this book was definitely Nigel, the vampire. He was easily the best character in the book, in my opinion. Now, while I liked the characters in the book, I could see some people maybe finding the characters to be a little cliched, but it really wasn't a problem for me. Now, I'll admit, when I first started reading this book, I didn't realize that this was actually the first of a series of novels, so there's a lot of things in this book that I thought were going to be resolved, but aren't resolved in the book, and I could see if you're reading this as a standalone novel, you might really hate it, because there's a lot of things that happen that don't get resolved, but I'm assuming they do get resolved in the sequels to this, which so far, to the best of my knowledge, there's only one other book in this series, and that's a book called Dead Indian Wars. Now, Dead Indian Wars, the second book in this series, I'm not sure if it's officially published yet or not, but once again, this first book in the series, I do definitely recommend. So yeah, that was my review on Dawn and Damnation by Clark Casey, and bye.